Picture the ultimate heist movie, right? But instead of a slick crew of master thieves trying to crack a heavily guarded vault, the protagonists are international law enforcement agencies. And their target isn't some bank, it is the entire global criminal underworld. Today, we're diving into what has to be one of the most audacious, literally mind-bending sting operations in the history of global security, Operation Trojan Shield. So let's dive right into this. For years, organized crime syndicates, we're talking the big guys, have relied on these hyper-secure encrypted smartphones to orchestrate their empires. They completely thought they were operating in the shadows, totally invisible to the police. But what if the very app they trusted with their lives, their money, and their deepest, darkest secrets was actually built, owned, and monitored by the FBI? Well, that is the incredible, high-stakes reality of the ANOM app. 27 million. Let that sink in for a second. That is the staggering number of intercepted messages collected by law enforcement during this operation. You know, we aren't talking about a standard targeted wiretap on a single mafia boss here. No way. We're talking about a massive global surveillance net that scooped up 27 million messages across more than 100 countries in real time. They were literally catching murder plots, multi-ton drug shipments, and massive money laundering schemes exactly as they happened. Part 1. Building the Trojan Horse. To really understand how they pulled off a surveillance operation of this completely unprecedented scale, we've got to look at how this monumental deception was actually engineered. Honestly, law enforcement relied on sheer opportunism. So back in 2018, a really popular secure messaging network for criminals called Phantom Secure gets shut down by the police. This creates a massive vacuum, right? The cartels desperately needed a new platform. Enter an FBI informant going by the name AFCO. Now, AFCO had been developing this next-generation encrypted app called ANOM. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he just hands it over. The FBI and the Australian Federal Police then step in and hardwire a silent, hidden decryption master key directly into the app's architecture. But here's the catch. To get criminals to actually use the thing, they needed street cred. So undercover agents hand a device to an Australian fugitive and alleged cartel boss named Hakan Ake. Fully believing this was the ultimate, untouchable secure network, Ake unwittingly becomes the app's absolute biggest promoter, pushing these phones deep, deep into the criminal underworld. And this brilliantly illustrates the dramatic irony of the whole setup. Think about the contrast here. On one hand, you have what the criminals experienced, which was pure, unadulterated security theater. I mean, these phones had their voice and GPS tracking totally disabled. You could only even open the app by entering a secret code into what looked exactly like a standard calculator app. It had a scrambled pin screen, a self-destruct feature, the whole shebang. But on the other hand, you have what the FBI saw. Absolute, total visibility. Every single time a criminal hit send, a hidden system copied the message, silently decrypted it with that master key we talked about, and routed it straight to law enforcement servers. These things called iBots. So the criminals felt perfectly 100% safe, all while the FBI was literally reading their diaries. Part 2. Springing the global trap. So once the trap was set, it was time to let it spring. And the adoption of these ANOM devices didn't just stay localized. No, it exploded across the global criminal ecosystem like a wildfire. I mean, the spread was incredibly effective. We're talking about 12,000 encrypted devices circulating among roughly 300 transnational criminal syndicates operating in over 100 countries. It got heavily adopted by mafias, outlaw motorcycle gangs, and massive drug networks, particularly over in places like the Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden. And honestly, here is the truly genius part of this whole thing. The police actually charged a monthly subscription fee for the service. I know, right? Paying for it created this false trust factor. The criminals just assumed that because it was expensive and exclusive, well, it absolutely had to be legit.
Part 3. The Takedown.
Now, for nearly 3 years, law enforcement basically just sat back, read the messages, and systematically mapped out the entire global underworld. It's like a giant puzzle they were piecing together. But eventually, the clock ran out. It was time for the payoff. On June 8, 2021, the trap snapped shut in this massive, synchronized global raid. Picture this. More than 9,000 police officers worldwide orchestrated the takedown. They made over 800 arrests globally, with 224 of those in Australia alone. And the seizures? Absolutely wild. They grabbed a staggering 40 tons of illegal drugs, confiscated 250 firearms, and recovered $48 million in cash and crypto. It was immediately touted as the biggest ever law enforcement operation against encrypted communication, period. But taking down a global network using a secretly controlled app? Yeah, that triggers an absolutely unprecedented legal nightmare. Detecting the crime itself is really only the very first tiny piece of this massive, sprawling web. All the rest of it represents the implementation, the messy prosecution phase, and navigating all these wildly varying national laws. This brilliant sting operation was about to collide head-on with the global justice system. Part 4. The shocking legal fallout. All right, let's step out of the action movie for a second and into the courtroom. The aftermath of Operation Trojan Shield has sparked what is arguably one of the most intense legal battles of the modern era. It's really questioning the very foundation of how global policing should even work. Looking at the timeline, you start to see a massive legal hurdle. The devices roll out in late 2018, right? But the FBI immediately faces a major obstacle. Under the Fourth Amendment, they couldn't legally intercept the data of U.S. citizens or even run this kind of operation from U.S. soil. So what do? In 2019, they outsourced the data routing to servers over in Lithuania to cleverly sidestep those legal protections. Fast forward, warrants are executed in June 2021, but almost immediately, the legality gets challenged in courts everywhere. And guys, the legal threat was actually so severe that by November 2024, the Australian government had to introduce a specific retroactive law. Basically, they did this to block defendants from challenging the legality of the ANOM sting in court, just trying to protect those convictions. And that brings us straight to the ANOM leaks. So there's this German lawyer, Christian Loden, co-founder of the Joint Defense Team, and he manages to get his hands on hundreds of pages of internal correspondence between the FBI and Lithuanian officials. His explosive allegation is that Lithuanian judges were deliberately misled. According to Loden, the police essentially portrayed ANOM as a criminally operated service that they were just covertly tapping into. They didn't admit that they actually owned the server and were running the whole app themselves. So the defense argues that this entire operation was fundamentally built on deceiving the very judges meant to provide oversight. So the crucial point here is that we are looking at absolutely massive stakes. From the defense's perspective, several foundational principles of law were allegedly breached. First off, you've got the right to a fair trial under the European Convention on Human Rights. That gets totally questioned if warrants were obtained using false narratives. Then, the rule of law itself is tested if constitutional safeguards are being bypassed just by routing data through third-party countries. And finally, there's the principle of mutual trust. This is the whole idea that nations trust each other's legal processes, and that trust gets severely fractured if foreign authorities were misled just to gain that data access. You see, the entire system of international law, like the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, it all relies heavily on protocols, treaties, and that mutual trust between sovereign nations we just talked about. When law enforcement employs total deception, even when it's against the world's worst criminals, it really stresses these international frameworks to their absolute breaking point. I mean, if courts are deliberately misled, like the defense is alleging, the constitutional role of the judge is completely bypassed, and that makes future international cooperation incredibly, incredibly fragile. And honestly, this is exactly why this matters for you to take away today. This isn't just some closed case from past history. It is actively playing out right now as we speak. Hundreds of people are currently sitting in prisons around the world based entirely on ANOM data. Their convictions are actively under review, they're facing high court appeals, or they're just being propped up by that controversial retroactive legislation we saw passed in Australia. It's a massive clash between global security forces and the fundamental rule of law, and it's happening in real time. Part 5. Justice versus deception. As we ramp up this explainer, we really arrive at the ultimate dilemma. It forces us to weigh two massive competing priorities against each other, catching incredibly dangerous criminals versus maintaining the absolute integrity of our legal systems. Now, Operation Trojan Shield undoubtedly removed tons of drugs and hundreds of dangerous weapons and criminals straight off our streets. It was an objective masterstroke of law enforcement logistics, for sure. But it also required police to build a global honeypot, bypass constitutional protections using foreign servers, and allegedly deceive the judiciary. So when we're dealing with the world's worst cartels, is that level of deception justified? Does the end justify the means? Or does bending the rule of law ultimately break the very justice system we're trying so hard to protect? Something to really think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.